Hello denizens of the internet, this is Kira Una coming to you today with a new project. Now, for those of you who are possibly of an investigative sort and would like a fashionable hat, or if you are from the Holo del Taco detectives over from Simply Nailogical's Discord channel, I have a special project for you. So today I'm going to teach you all how to make your own detective hat. So follow me and I'll show you how. Now, some of you may be familiar with the dad hats, for example. We have a nice bright logo, a really nice solid curved brim, and we have a adjustable slide thingy at the back. And there's also, of course, the sweatband on the inside, along with the Holo Taco logo and washing instructions. The detective hats are a similar way of how this top part is made. And before we get into the actual cutting and the sewing and all that, we need to make our patterns first. I'm gonna take you over to my ironing board here for a second. And yes, I'm sorry, we're gonna have to do some math. This is critical in order to get the shape right. So come over with me and we'll go through the math together. We have a couple of different elements to a detective hat. This is one that I made at class. I made one at school. We have some ear flaps to help either put it down if you want to keep your ears warm, because it is really cold just about everywhere right now. At the time of recording, it's like, I think somebody said that it was like minus 24 degrees Celsius first thing this morning. It's really cold. And apparently out around the Greater Toronto area, it is snowing right now. Aside from the weather, we're going to deconstruct this in a way that will help you to make sense of what you're seeing and how everything is constructed. Now this hat, obviously I made it earlier. This is one that I made, and the teacher gave me top marks on all of the plaid matching. You do not need to make your hat out of plaid. You can make it out of any pattern that you want. Plaid tends to be one of the more traditional detective kind of patterns. You can also use any kind of plaid you want, or if you won't even want to, you could go with something fun and funky like, I don't know, unicorns and rainbows, or galaxy sky, or however you feel that your hat will best fit you. Even if you are not a Holo Taco stan, you do not have to make a Holo Taco hat. You can put whatever you want on your hat that you prefer. It's totally up to you how you want to make your hat. So what I've done is I had some of these ribbons from like a previous Christmas gift that I recycled for this project. A little button on the top, and that button is actually made with a Canadian penny. I have a collection of them, and I know they're not being printed anymore, but it is the perfect size for a button on the top of the hat. Essentially 6 sections of the crown of the hat. You do not need to do 6 sections, but if you take a look at, just coming in here with the dad hat for a second. So if you take a look at the dad hat, you have 6 different sections of the hat that forms the crown. And you also have a brim. So my hat also has 6 sections and 2 brims. Pin here that I have is mainly just so that the hat on a really stiff, blustery day, or if I'm in the subway tunnels, it's so it doesn't fly off my head. And then if we take a look at the inside, you'll see that I've had it lined, and it's also fairly stiff, but it's not as stiff as the dad hats. The dad hats is a different kind of material, and you'll also see the sweatband ribbon that I attached on there. So I will show you how to do all of these things. So we have, and I'm going to assume during the process of this video that you all out there know how to sew, okay? This is how you can customize a hat to your own specifications, your own measurements. And this is something that is called flat patterning. Now, ideally, when you are doing a pattern of any kind, you will want to use pencil with an eraser in case you make mistakes, we're going to be using, just so that you can see this on screen really well, a green Sharpie for the lines that I'm making for my measurements to fuss with the geometry. Heads are round, bodies are round, and we're going to need to do a little bit of geometry and math. I'm also going to be using, for highlighting my final measurements, black Sharpie, so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to be using a protractor. You're going to need one of these for sure. You'll also need a ruler, especially considering that we're going to be working in inches. You're going to need a tape measure of some kind with numbers on it that goes all the way around your head. Ideally, you can use a dressmaker's measuring tape, but if you have just a string and a flat ruler, you can use that too. First steps first, you need to measure your head. And my head, and I'm gonna make this a little loose just to accommodate for, say, if I want to do a braid, because heads change in the seasons too, so it may swell or shrink a little bit. And my head size is, and I already knew this, but I'm going to share it anyway, my head size is about 23 inches around. We all know that the head is a round object. So your head is kind of a dome shape, and you have a bit of a round, and then you've got your ears, your hair, and then your eyes under the brim, and then your nose and mouth. So what we need is this 23 unit measurement that I just took is going to be for the total circumference of your head. You can make the round part of your hat as many segments as you want. Crown, which is the top part of the hat, that is called the crown, and that is usually quite often 4 pieces. For baseball hats, for dad hats, for this particular project, we're going to go with 6, because the more segments you have, the smoother the transition going all the way around your head will be. What we're going to need to do is we're going to need to take that number that you got for the circumference of your head and divide that by 6. So what that does is that gets us how wide each segment is going to be. Let me do some really quick math here with the calculator on my computer. That works out to 3.83333 inches. However, we want to work in fractions here. If you can't do it off the top of your head, I have a hard time doing it off the top of my head, you may need a fraction calculator. Used a calculator online and I got 3 7/8 of an inch for each of those sections. Then we want to take that measurement. We're going to go with the closest 1/8 of an inch here. Okay, so we're going to take that and we're going to divide that number again by 2, and I will explain that to you in just a little bit. So that gets me, after doing a little bit of math, looking around on the internet for that solution, we have 1 7/8 of an inch. What we need to do is we need to grab our ruler and we're going to make a line. So we're going to make this at the bottom of the page, make it as straight as possible. Use the grid marks on your ruler to make it straight. And then we're going to make another line. Okay, so 7 inches, right? Right. So make a mark at your 7 inches mark. You want to try and be as precise as you can with this, but it's okay if it's a little bit off. Keep in mind if it's more off than what I'm showing here, in terms of your own line mark making based on your measurements, you don't want to add more length or width or any lines more than a 1/16 of an inch, because otherwise that will throw all of the math off of what you're doing. Precision is important here, as best as you can. So we said that this was the diameter per piece, because we're going to be doing 6 pieces, and then we divided that in half, so 1 7/8. So we're going to take our ruler and we're going to do 1 7/8 and make a mark down here, so almost 2 but not quite 2, so 1 7/8 right there. Then what we're going to do is we're going to make a line that is 90 degrees again from that 1 7/8 mark, and we're just gonna make it about that long. That particular line doesn't matter yet. If you think about the geometry of a head, your head is 360 all the way around. Half of your head is 180, and a quarter of that is 90. What is a sixth of that? I'll give you a minute. The degree of per piece, the total amount of slant will be 60 degrees. But what do you do if it's only half? That's right, it's going to be 30 degrees. We're only doing half of the pattern. So you want to take your protractor, line it up, and mark from that 7 inches mark. So that is the 7 inches. And this is our 1 7/8. And then you want to make that 30-degree angle from this point. That's exactly what we're going to do. And we're going to make a line on that specific angle from that point to the second line that I told you. This is when the angle of the head starts tapering off. You really don't want to mess with this angle, and you don't want to mess too much with this line, because that is going to give you the length of your hat, and this gives you the width of each piece. But what do you do about this sharp angle? This is where you can play a little bit. You can make that as angled as you need to. Like you can make this a little bit more rounded if you need to. That's not a problem. What I would suggest is use something that is curvy, like the edge of your compass, for example, or you can use a flexi curve, or you can use a French curve. You can use the edge of a water bottle or a roll of tape or something round. And what you want to do is you want to have a curve that has this line meet this line. You can go above that line a little bit, but ideally you want to keep it inside this kind of house. That looks all right. We can sort of smooth that out a little bit. There. This is our hat pattern piece. It's not quite done yet. So we have a couple of things to do. Now keep in mind, this does not include seam allowance. Seam allowance is almost always added to patterns after all the drafting is done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab another piece of paper that's separate from this, and I'll show you how you can trace this to make your pattern piece. This looks good enough. I'll use some of this, just so you can kind of get an idea of the size. So let me just trim a little bit of this off. Okay, class, now pay attention. You do not need to use this kind of drafting dot paper or alphanumeric grid paper. This is something that sewists use for sewing stuff and making patterns or copying patterns so they can adjust it. You do not have to use this kind of paper. If you have just a plain white 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, that will be fine. When you're lining this up to trace on your pattern, you're going to want a fold in your paper, regardless of what kind of paper you have, and you're gonna want to leave yourself about 2-ish inches below that line that you made at the bottom, which is going to be the bottom of your hat. And I'm going to line this up as best I can, and I'm going to trace this out. And I'm going to use a black pen to trace out my final form before I put seam allowance in. And once again, preciseness is key here. Now you'll notice that I've stopped a little bit here. This is so I can get a really nice curve, because you want it to be gentle. You don't want it to be too hard. That'll do. Okay, so we have our pattern piece without seam allowance. We're going to take that pattern piece and fold it in half. So this is going to be cut on the fold. For anybody who knows how to sew, this is where we're going with this, okay? Now I'm going to make a little reminder mark on my pattern. This indicates that it's going to be cut on the fold. What we're going to do, just because not everybody is an expert sewist, not everybody understands seam allowances and things, so I'm going to give a generous 1/2 inch. If you need more seam allowance, make more seam allowance. There's nothing wrong with going 5/8 or even a full inch if you really need to, as long as you're accurate when you're sewing it and cutting it out, and you remember what your seam allowance is. I'm going to put a little reminder on this, just to remind myself, 1/2 inch. So I'm going to mark out 1/2 inch all the way around. And I'm going to leave just a scotch of a break at the top because you want to have that seam allowance flat. So we're going to mark 1/2 inch seam allowance here, and then we're going to flatten out the very top, the tippy top, because if you keep the points in, it'll fit funny. And when you go to cut this out on the fabric, you can make as many marks as you need to, so long as it washes out or wears out with heat afterwards. Use what tools and guides that you need to in order to make your pattern as easy to understand for you as possible. This is not for professional use, this is strictly for personal use. And then if you need to, use a couple of dots sticking at 90 degrees from the line that you made on the curve to copy that curve nice and neat to line it up so you have your seam allowance there, just like that. And then you can go back in and close up that cap. Hey, this turns out really nice. That looks really good. That's very reminiscent of the one I made earlier. Okay, now for the brim. That really depends on how far out you want it to stick out. When you're taking a look at any sort of hat that has a brim, you'll notice that it has a certain cutoff point. So if you take a look at how the dad hat is made, you'll see that the brim comes out a fair bit. It comes out about 3 inches. I think I made my hat about 2 inches with a brim. You can make your brim as long, as pointy, as differently shaped, as wild as you feel that you can make it, and as wild as you want to make it. But we're going with simplicity here. If you'll take a look at how many pieces, I don't know how well you can see this on camera, but you'll take a look and the dad hat comes up to 2 pieces of hat for the crown. And it comes out a little bit, like it ends about 1/4 into the next piece on the side. You can make, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to make it end a little shorter and I'm going to have it come out a little straighter. It may not have as stiff of a brim piece as the inside of this. This is probably a hard plastic of some sort. I don't have hard, I mean, I could get Phos-Shape, but that will make it complicated. You can use cardboard, by all means. If you feel that you want to use cardboard for your brim, you can use cardboard for your brim, or anything like a type of plastic on the inside. Just keep in mind that each different type of interior structure you use for this will have different properties. So to make the brim piece, we're going to again make it on the fold, but we're going to be using our previous math to figure out how many pieces we want it to stretch across. Ideally, you want it 2, because that will indicate the center front, and the center front is directly on the seam between, say, this piece and the next one. So if this was the center front of your hat, the start of the center of the brim would be here. This is one of the reasons why you don't add seam allowance and then do the math, because that will throw everything off. So we're gonna go back here for a second.
Editing Kira here. This is where I lost some of the plot and had to make a diagram. Because my math was wrong the first time and I had forgotten part of the process, I will later in the process have to go back in and make some adjustments to the ear flaps and redo the initial math for the brim pieces. The brim pieces that you see further along in the video is correct, but the ear flaps were a little bit long. Now, with regards to the math itself, I have this handy little graphic that isn't the prettiest to look at, but I really hope it explains the overlap of the seam allowance that will not overlap on the final hat. The only overlap for the diagram is there just to see how to draft each piece. So we have our head size of 23 inches in circumference. Then we add the 1/2 inch seam allowance on the interior and exterior of that 23-inch circumference line. This will allow for ensuring that you can see the geometry of the seam allowance for each of the crown pieces and at the circumference sewing line, but also to allow for the seam allowance at the circumference line for those earpieces and the brim. After completing this video and getting all of the subtitles sorted in English, I will eventually make a much cleaner diagram and a hat pattern for 23 inches for anyone to use for free. The pattern will be posted for download over on my Ko-Fi page for free.
I totally forgot to mention about patterning for the ear flaps. The ear flaps would essentially be the same length as one of these panels because it would be placed on the center seam, because as each piece aligns up, this will go on the sides of your head. So you want one that's wide enough and long enough. This is the height of your head, which will be advantageous to you to draft a new one. All you would really have to do is take your pattern piece, trace it out, and make the piece itself wider and more rounded for those ear flaps. And I'll do a demonstration of how to do that in a second.
The next day.
All right, so I have my brim piece, I have my ear flaps, and I have my crown pieces all cut out. So now we need to start talking about fabrics and supplies. I strongly recommend that you consider making a mock-up to fit you before you get into your really good fabrics.
Ed and Kira here. This is kind of where I say do as I say, don't do as I do. Please, please, please save yourself some frustration and headaches and make a couple of mock-ups if you happen to have the fabric to do so. I really wish I did. I didn't in this section, but I mean, at the end of it, the hat turned out okay. So anyhow, on with the rest of the video.
Now there is some things that you can do to make a mock-up. You can use scrap pieces of fabric if you already sew. Should be nice and easy. Who knows, maybe you'll make a wearable mock-up, which would also be kind of fun. Your base fabric, you can use something like flannelette. You can use wool. You can use quilting cotton. Funnily enough, on a previous version of this version of hat, I used this same buffalo check for the interior lining of my hat. There are other fabrics that you can use so long as it doesn't stretch. You do not want to use something that's stretchy. When it comes to millinery, or aka hat making, there are very few stretch fabrics that I would actually use, unless I had a bottom layer of something like Fosshape that I could stretch it over top of. Now there are uses for stretch fabrics in certain circumstances, but for this hat, it is not one of them, and especially not for a beginner. So don't get anything that's stretchy. You can totally get a fabric that doesn't stretch, that might even be hollow. There are companies that will print or have sequins or something shiny or flashy that you could totally use for this project, as long as it doesn't stretch. That is the key thing. If you want something shiny on it, you can always embroider or use that fusible vinyl. I'm gonna get into tracing this out. I hope I have enough of this fabric. I did start tracing it and then realized my pattern errors. So I have some markings on here, like I can cut the crown out no problem, but I don't know if I have enough for the ear flaps and for the brim. For the ear flaps, you can get away with supplementing a secondary fabric, again, so long as it doesn't stretch. So let's say, for example, I have enough for the outside of the flaps. So when it's down, it looks fuzzy. But when it's up, you can totally substitute quilting cotton with it, and you can have a nice contrast. Or you could get another, say for example, if you're doing green, like I am hoping I have enough here, you could probably get a green quilting cotton to put on the underside. So essentially it would be winding up being sandwiched, and the ear flap would look like this on one side and then that on the other. So I hope that clarifies. I will show you each step as I go. For the brim and stiffeners, you can use something like a thin piece of plastic from like a food tray if you need to. You might want to take a minute to, once you have the pattern cut out, you have to have it within the seam allowance, and that gets kind of tricky, but if you know how to do it, by all means, if you want to run with that option, feel free to do so. You might want to sand down the sharper edges so it's a little bit more curved, so that way it doesn't shred the fabric as you're walking and wearing the hat, and cut down your really super sharp corners to round them out and smooth them out so that way it doesn't poke you in the forehead. If you want to, you could use something that's a thermoplastic like Phos-Shape. That will be less likely to stab you in the forehead as you're wearing it. You could probably also get away with using something like a fairly stiff but thin EVA foam, or you might be able to get away with using Worbla. Just be certain that if you are using a microplastic that gets heated up, that has the potential to release fumes like Worbla, that you are using proper protection such as a respirator and filters, or make sure that you have a very well ventilated area before starting to heat that up, because you do not want to get sick or hurt yourself from heating up a heat forming plastic, because plastic fumes are bad. One of the things that we will be using, mainly to give the crown a little bit of structure, but also you can use it if you double it up on the inside of the brim. It won't be as stiff as like a baseball cap or like the dad hats, or as much as you might like it, but it is enough to give it a little bit of structure to get that shape. It is called Pellon Decor Bond. Interfacing is essentially a material that you use to stiffen or to support structure and item for wear for garments. Typically you'll find interfacing on the inside of waistbands, inside of collars, but in this case we're going to be using it for a hat. Now, if you're going to interface your hat so that it's a little stiffer, you probably want a secondary fabric as a lining. You can use something like that's shiny and a little bit drapey if you really want to. If you want to, you can go totally fancy with something like a silk or a satin. I will put examples of those materials somewhere on the screen so you can sort of see what I'm talking about. You can also, again, rely back on your quilting cotton if you really need to as a lining. I used quilting cotton for almost all of my hats in some shape or form for the lining, except for my pillbox hat. That one I went fancy and used a silk Shantung taffeta. Like you can totally have the lining as textured or even the outside of the hat. I mean, it's your hat. You can have it as textured or as non-textured as you want it. I mean, a double wool hat would be really warm, but you have to make sure you add a little bit in your seams and the size in general. So like size it up by 1/4 to 1/2 inch just to accommodate for any bulk in the fabric. You can make it out of fun fur if you wanted to, but that's where you really have to learn how to grade up your pattern so that it accommodates for all that extra fluff, especially if you're having that as a lining, because that will get thick and you want to make sure your head's gonna fit. Flannelette I would recommend as this part of this project, or quilting cotton, because it's not super thick. Flannelette is it has a texture to it, it's fuzzy, but it doesn't add a lot of bulk. If you're going something with like a tweed or a Melton wool or something along those lines, or a boiled wool, that is where you're gonna need to start adding a little bit extra. And with any project in terms of sewing, you're gonna need a matching thread. Yeah, that's pretty close. So that's probably the thread that I'm going to use. When you're dealing with iron-on interfacing, you're going to need an iron. That is unavoidable. It doesn't have to be a steam iron. Actually, most of the time, even though it says to use steam, I don't use steam. But if you're ever not sure with the type of interfacing you're using, always read the instructions. A lot of them will come with a runner to go along with it, like this. You do not need hat wire for this. You can on the brim if you want to, but you have to do that on the inside of like wire along the brim itself. And for anybody who is using historical techniques, if you really want to go 1890s with this, you can use buckram. This is millinery buckram. It is a stiffened cotton material that is an open weave that is starched all to hex, so it's super stiff, and it is intended for the interior structure of hats. The one downside is if it gets wet, you're gonna have a hard time trying to get it to reform its shape. So if you are going to use buckram as your interior, make sure that you waterproof your fabric. Haha! I found it! I do have extra Phos-Shape bits. Ha 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 ha! I have been working on a couple of projects, and I think I might actually have enough. So, say for example with this piece, you have one that's long enough, but you need a little bit more width for at least one side. You can, say for example, take your pattern piece, chop it up here, put it over here, and then take your zigzag stitch, go over top of it, and then when you want to harden it, you can take your iron and use a Teflon plate. This is a little bit more advanced for those of you who actually have advanced knowledge of sewing. You want to use a Teflon plate when you're working with floss shape, otherwise it will stick to your iron. So using a Teflon plate will help prevent it from sticking. Alternatively, what you can do is for cooking, there are these Teflon sheets that you can use to sandwich your fabric into for your floss shape. Stick it between the two layers, like so, and then iron it flat. It won't stick, and it will come out really nice and flat. Now, for those of you who don't have access to floss shape, because it is fairly expensive, but you can get your hands on the Deco Bond or a really thick, very stiff interfacing. What I would suggest is when you go to cut your fabric out, you want to cut it on the ins, like the ½ inch on the inside, so then that way you don't have too much bulk on the seams, because trying to sew through all of that as interfacing is a little bit tricky. So what you might want to do is copy this and then trace out your ½ inch line away from the edges to get the inner piece. Line it up as best you can, iron it together, but do that on the top and the bottom pieces of your brim pattern. I will demonstrate that for you just for the sake of this particular tutorial, just so that you can see how you can stiffen your brim without having to do anything overtly fancy with it. Now, when you're working with fabric, generally speaking, if it's flannelette or if it's like super wrinkly like this, before you make your mock-up and before you go into your final project, you'll want to iron everything out. I'm not going to worry about ironing this at the moment. This is to show you how to cut out your pattern piece. I'm going to go into a couple of technical terms here, and hopefully this will help all of you with learning how to sew, how to align your pattern pieces on your fabric. So we have our pattern piece, and you'll notice that I have two little notches in the pattern piece. That designates the center of the pattern piece itself. But what it also does is it indicates the grain line. The grain line is the direction that the little threads in the fabric move. So if you take a look at this piece here, you'll see that there's a bunch of little dots and all this fuzzy stuff. Essentially, the threads that run the length of it, that is called the warp of the fabric. That is the first thing that's put onto a loom when it's being manufactured. And then all these fuzzies are from the weft, which is the pieces of thread that go from side to side to make the fabric as a whole. What you want to do when you're lining up your pattern pieces is you want this line in the middle to be parallel to the edge of the fabric that is manufactured with all these fluffies. If you're not sure of which edge that you're working with, if all of it's cut off and you don't have what's called the selvage, this is called the selvage edge, that tells you which direction that the fabric needs to go in. You can figure out what the fabric's bias is either by a pattern with check that's printed like this. It's close enough to what's on the warp and weft. You could probably figure out if it is a plaid or if it's a check like this, which direction the fabric is going. It's okay if you put things on the cross grain, which is the warp and weft direction, instead of on the selvage edge direction, which is up and down. If you're not sure, you can always take a piece of fabric and see if it stretches at all. This has a very minor stretch to it, but it's not super noticeable. Like, it's not going to keep that shape. And this way, it doesn't stretch at all. Like, yes, I'm tugging on it, but you can see that it's not giving. Now, if you went corner to corner, which is called the bias, this folded edge here is considered the bias. And if you lay your fabric flat, and if you pull on it, because you can tell which direction it is by the corners of squares, it stretches a fair bit. And that is how you can tell which way you want to place your pattern. You don't want to place your pattern on the sides that stretch. You want to place it in a direction that it's not going to stretch at all. So when you're taking your pieces, your tops and bottoms of each piece, so in this case, you remember the fold on grain, that is also your grain line. You want to place your pattern piece with the top and bottom notches and that center line parallel to this fuzzy edge, or the selvage edge, or the grain line of the fabric. If you really want to be super accurate with it, you can take a ruler. Ideally, you can want to use one that's clear, but you can use just like one of those 6-inch sewing rulers, and you can measure from the, not quite on the fuzzies, but on the line that where the fabric actually starts. You can measure from that line to your center point and then match that with the bottom part of the notch. So that way it's super straight. I would suggest take a moment, make extra copies of your pattern and keep one as your master pattern. Because if you're making multiple iterations or if you're doing adjustments, you will need extra copies so you can fidget around with it and make those extra copies. This, I'm fairly confident, is actually going to be pretty good. So I'm going to take a look in my stash of scraps, see what mock-ups that I previously had made to use to make a mock-up of this. Now, what we're going to do when you're making a mock-up, you're going to take your copy of your pattern, you're going to pin it to the fabric, carefully trace around it, and then lift it off and cut it out. The reason for that being is because you're going to want to keep those notch marks available, and it's also so that you can kind of see what you're doing when you're making your mock-up. It's a lot easier to cut it out than having the paper in the way. That is just my opinion, but it'll also help you with any plaid matching as well. So then that way you have, like, you can take your copy, take a pencil crayon or something, make an outline of the pattern that is on the previous piece, and then pattern match as you go. So then that way your patterns and your stripes or your plaids, they all match up all the way around as consistently as you possibly can get it. So a little bit of a pro tip on pattern matching. So let me get back to you on finding a piece and we'll get started on cutting this out. This fabric's a little dusty. It's been sitting around for a little bit in various folds. As you can see, it's a little bit wrinkly. So I have decided that I'm going to use this as my fabric. We're going to talk a little bit about fabrics here for a second. If you take a look, this doesn't stretch at all. This is quilting cotton that I'm using here. I found out that I don't have enough of the flannelette. This is what this is, or it's some sort of flannel. It's fuzzy, it's cotton. It's what you might make like a baby blanket or kids' clothes or something warm and fuzzy for yourself. I love flannel in the winter for my legs because the fuzziness helps to keep things warm a little bit. So I'm making the main body out of the flannel, but I'm going to make the underside of the ear flaps out of this sort of rose patterned green colored quilting cotton, so that in that way that sort of dark green vibe matches. It may not necessarily be an exact match because this reads a little bit warmer. This reads close but slightly cooler, but I'm okay with that. You may have a different vibe that you want to go for in general. And I'm going to take a look and see, I don't know if I have enough, but I'm going to take a look and see if I have enough pieces of this offcut. This is something that somebody gave me from school, and this is to make the inside lining of the crown. So I'll see if there's enough pieces. If not, I'll pick something else. I've got plenty of scraps to work with. I don't think I have any green scraps, but I could be wrong. If not, I have a bunch of fat quarters for quilting. For what anybody wants to know what a fat quarter is, it's essentially sort of a chunky piece of a quarter of a yard. Yes, I know I'm committing a sewing sin by not ironing it first. You can use pattern weights like what I've got here. I've made a couple of my own, and I've got a store-bought one here. To trace your pieces out, you can use a contrasting tailor's chalk, You can use a Crayola marker, one that says that it will wash out and is intended for kids, but you generally want to pick a color that's close but not close enough that you can't see where your lines are going to line up. You can use Frixion markers because that will erase in the heat. However, if you are going to use a Frixion marker because you're going to be tracing this out onto your interfacing, you will want to make a small clip where your alignment markers are. And you make that into the seam allowance, but don't go past the seam allowance because you will need that to line it up. Or something like heat erase white marking pen if you need to as well. So use whatever tools you have that are of your choice. I'm going to use the red Frixion marker. Because this interfacing doesn't have a grain, and the grain would be where the threads go either up or down or left or right, we're just going to copy this on the not shiny side and cut them out. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to trace my pattern pieces so that way they have only the inside edge, and I'll have it so that I have a notch on the inside as well, just so I can get my placement. I just need a minute to trace this. Give me a sec, I'll be right with you. Now, why are we doing this? Because we're trying to reduce bulk on the seams itself. So by eliminating that seam allowance for the interfacing and only for the interfacing, it's going to make it so that the seams aren't super bulky. You'll see what I mean in a minute. It's not going to take away from any of the structure. It'll just make it a little bit easier to manipulate. We'll get there, don't worry. And because it's on the inside, it doesn't have to be super precise. It has to be precise, but it doesn't have to be super precise. And this is why I have a little hole at the very tip. So that way I know where my seam allowance starts and where the pin is supposed to go. And then I can trace all that out with just a ruler 1/2 inch in. You can fold where those clip markings are, like that. And we're just gonna cut on the inside of that line. And remember, do not use fabric scissors for paper. So we're going to copy this out. We're going to trace it out. Now, this is especially handy if you're using a brim piece that's a cardboard. You don't want to be sewing through cardboard. So that's why we're doing this. Because sewing through cardboard would be very tricky. Another thing that you can use is if you have leather offcuts. You could use leather if you wanted to. Leather in itself won't degrade too easily when it gets wet. It'll shrink a little bit, but you can dry it out so that it's still usable. And it's biodegradable far more than pleather or plastic or any variety of. Another alternative that you can use is the inside of the brim here. And this is something that I just thought of. There is some sticky tack that you can get that's in cork form. You could probably cut a sticky tack piece out of cork, kind of like, you know how shoes have cork in them? You could probably do that. I don't know how heavy that would be, but that is a possibility of use. And I am sorely tempted to try that. So that's my brim piece, and these are my crown pieces. I tell you what, I will let you all decide what you're planning on using at home. I think I'm gonna dig out a couple of pieces of Fosshape and use that for the inside of my brim. They don't have to be very big, they're just gonna be this size. Let me cut out these first with the Decor Bond, and then I'll get some Foshape, cut that out, and I'll show you how you use it. Turn up the heat on my iron. I'm gonna grab my water bottle. It has a little bit of alcohol in it, but it should do just fine. Ideally, this is just to get a little bit of steam rather than using the steam reservoir, because the water in Toronto is really hard, so it tends to gum it up a little bit. That's why I'm not putting water in the tank at the moment. So I'm gonna get my Teflon. While the iron's heating up, I'm gonna go over what we have supplies-wise so far. So we have our interfacing for the crown, the interfacing for the brim, the flush shape for the brim. I know not many of you are going to have it, but I'm just going to go through it to show you how to use it. We have the lining for the inside of the hat. We have some scrap pieces to set up our button. We have all of the outer shell pieces for the crown cutout. We have the brim pieces cut out for the outer shell of the brim. And we have the bottom and the top of the ear flaps. And we have some ribbon to tie up the ear flaps with after we're done. And then I've got a penny off camera for making the button on the top. So what we need to do first is we need to take all of these pieces and we need to adhere all of these pieces onto the inside. This is the interfacing, and then we're going to adhere each one to the outside shell. So this is how ideally it's going to sit. You want about half an inch at the top, half an inch at the bottom, half an inch on the sides. I'm going to probably use a ruler to square that up, and I'm going to do for the brim, I've got 4 pieces. I've got 4 pieces of the outer shell for the brim, so one of these are going to go on each one of these. So we're going to line these up. I'm going to use a ruler just to get that as close to the middle as possible. And this will also kind of give you sort of a quasi sewing line to work with as well. You'll see that it's kind of like placing it directly where your sewing line is going to be. It's not going to be 100% exact, but it's going to be good enough. So now that we have it relatively lined up, to prevent it from sticking to the iron, I'm going to use a second sheet. Iron feels like it's relatively heated up. And we're just going to press. Yes, this will sort of squish the flannelette a little bit, but it won't be too bad.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
I know that's probably not long enough, but it did help flatten it a little bit. If you really need to, you can flip it over once it's kind of sort of stuck. Spray the top of it a little bit, and then flatten it again. Ideally, and I'm going to risk sticking this to my iron here for a second. Ideally, you want to iron everything before you do this, but I didn't for whatever reason. Everything's flat. Let's get some steam. For anybody who does iron manufacturing, if you can, for like semi-professional use, have an option to turn the auto off, please. Okay, that's better. That's a little stiffer. It's still not quite fully bonded, so I'm going to go over that a little bit more. The difficulty with using the Teflon plates or the Teflon sheets is that yes, it prevents stuff from sticking to stuff. However, I find that this kind of insulates a little bit and it doesn't let the heat to fully pass through. So you gotta heat it up a little longer than you normally would. And I forgot to mention also, when you're working with fabrics, you wanna pick something that's not gonna melt when you have to iron interfacing to it.
A few minutes later.
Yeah, that's pretty good. And anything else we do afterwards, the top stitching will prevent it from peeling up because it'll be sandwiched nice and neat on the inside of the brim like that when you're done sewing it. Once again, this is flush shape and it looks like cotton batting, but it's not. There's a secret. So we're gonna put it between both layers because if you don't, it will stick, just as a fair warning. We're gonna make it as flat under the sheets as possible, and then we're gonna hit it with the iron. You wanna keep the pressure as even as you can. It is a thermoplastic, hence the reason why I am using an iron. I don't believe there is any safety hazards with this. It wasn't advised that there was any at school. It doesn't really smell like anything when it's heated up either. Ooh, nice. Now, if you want it super flat, what you want to do is you want to let it cool. If you need to round it out, do that after you're done sewing and use a tailor's ham and just use the iron to gently recurve it. This can be reshaped and remelted if you need to. And if you look, it's not very floppy anymore. It's kind of stiff. So this is an option for the inside brim if this is something that you want to invest in. It is not cheap. It's like $30 a yard or something like that, but it can give some amazing results. So now it's kind of like a fuzzy cardboard, and we're going to do that for both sides of the brim. Now, while I'm doing that, take a tea break, watch some TV. I'll finish putting all the interfacing on. I'll come back a little bit later and we'll get into the sewing. I have my sewing machine set up. I have a sharps or woven sort of needle. If you only have universal, that's fine. That is certainly something that you can use. Keep in mind, universal is not always a one size fits all sort of scenario. It's one of those it gets the job done sort of scenarios. So that is just something to watch out for. This is a little bit tricky to film, so if I bump the camera, I apologize. For anybody who is following along with this tutorial at home, who do not have access to a sewing machine, keep in mind that you can also do all of this hand sewing. Like, you can sew all of this by hand if you need to. Also note, one of the things I forgot to add on the materials list, you will need a hand sewing needle and thread for this project afterwards, because you got to sew the button on. If all you have at home to make this is by doing hand sewing, you can totally hand sew this whole thing. You just have to really keep your stitches small and make sure you press all of your seams open and leave yourself a guideline to make sure all of your seams are even. With that said, we are going to proceed with using the sewing machine. We are at the sewing machine right now. If you remember, your seam allowance is 1/2 inch. So we are going to start with the brim pieces, and we're going to sew at that 1/2 inch line. So you're going to want to line it up as best as you can. It's an autofocus. Okay, so if the autofocus does its thing, I apologize on this camera and on this camera here. We're going to sandwich the two pieces of the brim pieces together. Line them up as best as you possibly can. You can use as many pins as you feel that you need to. Do what you feel necessary to get the same result. You don't necessarily have to do exactly the same thing I do. Sometimes I might take a couple of shortcuts to get this started. Start at the curved top of the corner, put my presser foot down, follow the 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. And again, this will not necessarily be perfect, but it will be good enough. This is the 5/8 line, that is the 1/2 inch. I'm going to make sure my needle is centered. It's not on a zigzag stitch, it's only on a straight stitch. And we're going to sew all the way around the brim piece. Let's get started. So start slow, do a couple stitches forward, backwards, forwards, and go. If you need to make these really tight curves, lower the presser foot into the fabric, lift the presser foot up, pivot it just a little bit, and then continue sewing a couple stitches. You don't want to go fast. If you need to, use the hand wheel. Take your time, go slow, and try and keep it as accurate and as neat as you possibly can. And believe me, leaving the needle into pivot will make it so much easier for you to get a really nice curve. And just remember, go as slow as you need to. As you'll notice, even me, somebody who has been sewing for as long as I can remember, I'm taking my time with this. Going nice and slow, nice and even. And just remember, if you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. You can always unpick it and sew it again. Unless you're working with vinyl, and then you might have to deal with some of the scarring, but you know, I would not recommend using vinyl as a beginner project. Granted, hollow vinyl would be really cool as a hat, but it would be really sweaty. Okay, so you see this point here on the interfacing where it is? We're going to sort of stop at that level just so that we can flip this piece inside out. That's good enough. So once it's done, reverse to stitch. By about 3 or 4 stitches, come back again. Nice and slow. Make sure the needle is out. Lift the presser foot and release. And this is something that you're going to do on both sides. So both pieces of this brim piece is what you're going to do the exact same thing. To make it easier to turn inside out and to make all of your curves super even, you can get, if you need to, a pair of pinking shears. And you can clip around the curves. It makes all these teeth that you can see, like so. It makes all these edges, and you want to get as close to your sewing line as you can without going over. And what that does is it'll make it a little easier for you to turn inside out, clip, and essentially fold it in so it's really nice and neat. If you do not have pinking shears, you can go around the corners and make these the same way as the pinking shears, just a little bit bigger, like that. And then that way, again, it essentially serves the same purpose. It's like pinking shears, just bigger. You can make as many V's as you want to. You can use pinking shears if you have them, but if you don't have them, that is your alternative method. We're going to leave that extra selvage room. We're going to, for the moment, flip this inside out. There we go. So you see how nicely that sort of turned and lays flat? That is ideally what we want. Now you can take this over, and I highly recommend that you do this. Take it over to your ironing board, give this another good press. That way it will sort of get everything to lay nice and flat and straight for you. All right, so here we have our 2 pieces of the brim. This is going to be the front and the back of the head. I'm going to press these down, and what you want to do is you want to try and have that seam as equal between the top and bottom when you go to iron it as much as possible. So we're going to give that a good press, make sure everything is nice and flat, and I will go into the next steps. This is only if you are using Fosshape or a piece of plastic or buckram or something that you're using as an interlining to really give your brim a stiffened look. So I'm going to use my piece of Foshape. I realize you can't really see it on the upfront camera, but you can probably see it on the other camera. And we're going to essentially tuck the Foshape into that little pocket. This is one of the reasons why we do not sew this edge open first. And you want to try and get it between the layers as best as you can. So you're going to put your hardened piece of buckram or cardboard or cereal board or Foshape or piece of plastic, whatever you're using, right inside, and you want to butt that and get it as far down into this seam as possible. So you don't want to tear your piece, obviously, but you want to make sure it's really nice and secure. This is why accuracy is super key. So now this is like extra stiff. Now, if you do not have an interlining, that is perfectly okay. You can probably get away with this as a costume piece without it. Anybody who's wanting to use this as a regular use item, or if you're planning on wearing the ever heck out of this hat, you're probably gonna want a stiffening layer. Now, before we get started in on the crown, I totally forgot about top stitching. So what top stitching is, it is stitching on the top of a piece of garment, fabric, whatever it is that you're doing that's kind of a functional and or decorative. So if you are stitching with hollow thread or glow-in-the-dark thread or rainbow color changing thread, now is the time to get that out and do this part. Interlayer, whether it's a cardboard, or in this case it's going to be Foshape. It's so that you can sew through it. You don't want it super thick so that you can't, because this is something that you'll see on other hats that are out there in the wild, where there's stitching all the way around the brims. We're going to do exactly that to start with as a securing layer to make sure that all of those layers of FOSS shape, or in my case, the double layer of the interfacing, don't go anywhere. So what top stitching is essentially is you're going to take your presser foot, and this is kind of where you get to play with it a little bit. If you happen to know how to do it, you could probably put a design somewhere here on the brim piece. Just remember which side's the top and which side's the bottom, the one that's going to face outwards or the one that's going to face your face. If you want to, you can have it at 1/8 of an inch, which is essentially putting the piece of fabric at the edge of the presser foot and then moving the needle a little closer. So you have that at 1/8 of an inch. You can do it at 1/4 of an inch, which is where the needle is centered. You can do 3/4 of an inch, which is all the way to the other side. Anyhow, it is up to you how far in you want to make that top stitching. But top stitching is key because it will prevent anything from slipping and sliding around. It'll make sure it's all nice and secure. And it'll also help prevent wear and tear too, because if you're wearing this a lot, you'll have a bunch of layers rubbing against each other, which could cause a little bit of wear and tear. And that's something that you don't necessarily want. Now for this hat, just to keep it nice and simple, I'm going to do 1/4 inch, but only all the way around here for now. If you get your pattern piece out and if you mark an extra line for where you want to sew along here, you can sew along this edge here and trap the layers if you sew down far enough. So let's get started on doing the brim. If you are uncertain, if you have a strong enough needle, make sure you put on safety glasses, or make sure that you are using a thick enough needle that will go through all of the layers that you're using. You do not want to get any broken needle in your eyeball. That would be bad. I care about all of you. I want to make sure you can all see. So no accidents to the hospital. Stay safe. I'm putting my glasses on. I know I look really dorky. I've probably shown what I look like with my glasses on before. So again, forward, backward, forward. You can hear the tone, it's chunky. If you have to, go slow and use the hand wheel. I think I might actually do that. And then just a little bit up. I know this looks like it's gonna take forever, but it'll be worth it. Go slow, take your time. That's what the hand wheel is there for. I should be able to level this out without using the hand wheel till I get to the next corner. And just remember, guide the fabric, don't try and force it, because that's how you also wind up with broken needles. There we go. Oh good, the tension didn't get messed up. As you work through thicker fabrics, sometimes the bottom tension can get a little messy, so that is something also to be aware of. This seems to have kept fairly even. This was the bobbin side, or bottom side, and this was the top side. So not bad. Okay, so what we're going to be doing next is we're going to be moving on to what's known as the crown of the hat. This is the 6-part thing that goes on the top and around your head. So much like how we did with the brim just now, what you want to do is you want to line up your fabric in its nice little sandwich as best as you can, wrong sides together, and you want to sew at that 1/2 inch seam allowance. You want to sew only 3 pieces together at a time, and I will explain in a minute. So give me a second to sew this all up, and I will cut to a spot where I'm going to show you what to do next.
5 minutes later.
There's a couple of things that you should do if you can. If by any chance you don't happen to have a tailor's ham, what you can do for these seams, and this is for anything that has a round surface, is you can take a towel that is clean, you want to use a clean towel, ball it up, and use that as your surface. Because you can use this sort of blunted end to support what you're ironing so you can press open all the seams. So what we're going to do, I'm going to show this two ways. I'm going to show with the towel and then I'm going to show with the tailor's ham. So what you kind of want to do is have your towel sort of ball up a little bit like that. And you put your hat over top of the flattest part that you possibly can get out of your towel. And yes, I know some of the seams are not caught, but we're going to catch them. We're going to do some top stitching a little bit later on these pieces. Don't worry. This is just step one. What you're going to want to do is put open all the seams and iron them open. The ironing will help to keep them open. Now, be careful that you use only the tip of your iron, and be careful, it will be hot. So don't burn your fingies. And you're going to want to just gently press that open, just like that. And I'll finish this half with the towel, just so you can kind of get an idea. And again, keeping those open. Use the iron tip if you have to. Just be very careful you don't burn yourself. And you want to keep a round object underneath so then that it keeps that kind of nice curve. And just adjust it as you go. Again, there's no rush. You don't have to go at lightning warp speed. This is supposed to be for funsies. You don't want to hurt yourself when you're doing stuff for funsies. These might stick out just a little bit. If you really need to afterwards, you can, if you happen to have a flat-headed pin, you can use that to secure it down. It's kind of like making a clapper without actually having one. You can pin that open, kind of like that, as flat as you can get it. Then take your iron, heat it up for a minute just to get it really nice and flat, and then let it cool. And then when it's cool, take the pins out. That way is another method that you can keep that nice and flat. And get it as flat as you can. It doesn't have to be perfect, but something is better than nothing. Even if you only have your fingers to use and you don't have an iron, use your fingers. Use your pins. Use a bit of water, spray it down, let it dry. If you pin it open the way I just showed you, like if you use just a little bit of water, spread it open, pin it in place, and then let it dry on the curve. That will probably also help you. It's a long method to do it, but it can help in certain circumstances. Hot tips if you don't have a hot iron. And just remember that any interfacing that you get, if you don't have an iron and you can't heat it down, you can always sew it in by doing a little bit of what's called stay stitching, which is essentially you just kind of stitch it so that it stays in place. And then when you're done sewing, because everything is going to be top stay stitched afterwards, then you don't have to worry about it going anywhere. And then you could just take the what's called basting thread, because you're essentially basting it into place, and you can just pull that out. What I would suggest though, if you're using a basting thread, use an alternate color so you can see it on both sides, so you can see what's going on. Okay, now that I'm done with the towel method, I'm going to tuck that away and use my ham. This is stuffed with just wood chipped hamster bedding, and the kit itself comes with just the fabric. If you are interested, I don't know if she still sells it, but her name is Shannon Makes. She is here on YouTube. She makes some fantastic videos. She's currently doing renovation videos at the moment. You know, send a shout out to her way if you want to. So let's pull that out, heat that down. Again, watching your fingies. Don't hurt your fingies. Don't burn yourself on the iron. If you don't have this kind of iron, but you have a hair iron, that is also something that you could possibly use, but you also want to do a press test on a piece of scrap first to make sure you're not going to burn the fabric, because fabric and hair are two different things. But you also run the risk of having the interfacing sticking to your hair iron, so it's one of those unconventional methods, but you gotta be careful. You know, don't set your house on fire for a craft, and don't electrocute yourself. You know, common sense things when crafting. All right, let's see how well this fits. Ooh. Not quite the investigative look that we're trying to go for just yet, but it fits really nicely. I am pleased with this. Okay, so we're going to go back to the sewing machine. I'm pointing over here because the sewing machine's like right there. So we're going to go back to the sewing machine and we are going to sew up that pinned seam that I just used to try this on. Actually, we need to do some top stitching first, now that I think about it, because I'm trying to make this as easy for all of you to follow as possible. And rather than trying to fight with multiple pieces once it's all seamed up together, instead of like trying to clamshell it, we're gonna do one half at a time. So then that way the interfacing is stitched down and kept in place. So let me unpin this. Let's go back over to the sewing machine and then we'll get into top stitching, and then I'll show you how to put the two clamshell pieces of the hat together. Before we get into sewing the two halves into one contiguous piece, you want to make sure again that all of your seams are pressed wide open. It's a little hard to see, but they are pressed open. If you need to, pin them down on the inside so that it's not going to go anywhere, and you can remove the pins as you need them. Now, just so that you can see what I'm doing, I'm going to show you on camera 1. And I'm going to try and squeeze it in frame here on camera 2. No, that's not working. Okay, there it is. So you can see the pin is there, and it's going to hold that flap in place. So you're probably going to want to pin all the way around. I'm not going to. I think I can control this in a way that it's not going to get too fiddly, if that makes sense. So you want the pins to be removed from this is the outside. Okay, this is what's going to be seen to the public. You want to position the center of your presser foot at the center of that stitch line. To figure out how far out you want the sewing line to be, if you have a very old machine that doesn't have a function where you can sew that far, like you can't move the needle from right, center, or left, you may need to move the fabric itself. Make yourself a drawing line of some sort in either something that heat erases or something that fast fades or something that can be brushed out like chalk, because you want to keep this as precise as possible, because what this is going to do is it's going to trap the interfacing layer, which is this layer on the bottom. And you can see it's already peeling up, but we're going to fix that. We're going to make it so it doesn't peel back up when you go to wear it and when it's finished, which is what this top stitching is going to be for. Now, I'm going to use the other camera to show you sort of where I'm starting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the top where all 3 points meet and work my way on both the left and the right. So I'm going to use, let me show you that seam again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the very top of the hat, like at the very, very tippy top where the button would go. And then using this as my center line, as my guideline, I'm going to move the needle to one side, stitch from the top and come all the way down, and then move the needle to the other side, which is the right side, and again, start at the top, work all the way down. And I'm going to do that for this piece and this piece, and then I'm going to do that for the other side of the hat as well. This will make it so much less fiddly, so that the only one major seam for top stitching that you have to do is when you fit the whole clamshell together. So let me get into that and I will show you on the other camera what I'm talking about. So I just wanted to pop in here really quickly and show you that this is ideally the kind of thing you want. Yeah, you might get a little minute bunching, but that's okay because that's what we have a lining for. And if you take a look at it on the outside, it's nice and round and smooth. There's no lumps or bumps, and it's looking pretty good. So now that we have our pieces together, ignore the fact that I have the interfacing coming out. That will be fixed momentarily. Nothing I haven't had happen before. It's essentially just, it came undone from being glued down for whatever reason. If you really need to, pin it in place. We will be sealing that together with some top stitching after. I had you do the interior top stitching first to get the hardest part out of the way rather than struggle bussing through the entire process, because that's what I did the first time, and it didn't help. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take our two pieces, we're going to put them right sides together, line up the points as accurately as possible. And if you need to, use a lot of pins. We're going to take the two tips. So I have one here and then the other one here. We're going to match up the very tips where all three meet as best as we can. And we're going to sew at the 1/2 inch mark and go all the way around. So we're going to sew at the 1/2 inch mark for both of these pieces. Use a lot of pins if you need to. We're going to go all the way around. So that way there's no budging or fudging and stuff. And just as a reminder, go slow, take all the time you need, take all the pins that you need. Make sure you remove the pins as you're sewing. Then what we're going to do is we're going to clip those curves, turn it right side out, press all those seams open, and top stitch all of those seams as they're flapped open. It is a longer seam, so it will be a little bit more of a struggle, but it'll be worth it.
Many minutes later.
Almost everything lines up really nicely. That is the end goal that you want, and that is the dead center of the top of the hat. All right. Fit check time. That looks really good. This will be a little bit shorter, so this will come up 1/2 inch because this is just the raw seam, and everything will fit really nicely. Ooh, this is a good hat. Good hat so far. All right, we need to, what's the next step? Either lining or ear flaps. Let's do lining first. The lining is pretty much the same way that you assemble the cap, so I'm not going to go too much into detail for that. And the second one is going to be the ear flaps, which is a little tricky, but it's doable. So while I'm sewing up the seams for the lining, you all go get a tea, paint your nails, oil up your nails, and do whatever you need to do. Walk the dog, take a break, and I'll come back with you when the lining is done. Now, I just wanted to show you before I totally lose the daylight is that your lining does not have to be the same color all the way inside. You can if you want to, or you can if you only have scraps like what I did, is I used some of the floral that I used for the bottom of the ear flaps, and I only was able to manage to get 3 pieces out of it. It wasn't going to be a nice even 6. And I used some of this black and white flowered one. So what I've done is I've kind of alternated on the inside, and I'm going to have green, black and white, and green on the other side of that same clamshell, and this is for the lining. Also, you can, but you do not have to, and it will lay a little bit easier and nicer if you do, but you do not have to if you don't have the spoons or want to clip the curves of this particular seam. I know there's going to be seamstresses and sewists out there that will be like, no, what are you doing? Stop telling them that. Again, it's going to be on the inside of the hat and it won't really matter. So unless you're really texture sensitive, you really don't need to. So this is going to be a little bit shaky, but I wanted to try and get this in before I totally lose the light. So you remember how I said to make sure that you copy your little notches at each end? Well, there is a purpose to that. See, I've got a little nick in the fabric there and another little nick on the other side. So this is the bottom side of the ear flap, and this will be the top side of the ear flap. Now, what we want to do is we want to have our ribbon sandwiched in between those 2 layers. So what you want to do is you want to get your ribbon, make sure you cut one end as straight as you possibly can. And what we're going to do is we're going to line this up at a 90-degree angle. I'm not going to do this on camera because I'm working with one hand free here and one hand holding the camera. Center your ribbon that you're using for the ties for the top of the hat as close to centered as you possibly can on that little cut. So the center of that should meet the center of that. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take your lining fabric or the outer fabric or whatever layer that you have determined is the bottom and the top side, and you're going to lay that over top. And then at the sewing machine, you're going to sew all the way around here, and you're going to trap the ribbon inside this seam and go all the way around here. That will effectively trap this ribbon on the inside of the ear flap at the end, so then that way you have all this place to tie it up when you turn it right sides out. And with any curved seam, when you get to that stage, you're going to want to make clips here and clips here around the curve so it turns around nice. And we're going to top stitch that down. Now, before I get started sewing in on any of the seams, use as many pins as you feel you need to. And this is where the ribbon is sitting. One for the outside of the ribbon, center of the ribbon, and the other edge of the ribbon, just so that I can really hold it in place. And you want to make sure that the tail of the ribbon, this is the tail of the ribbon sitting on the fabric, you want to make sure that that will not get stuck in any of the seams. So I'm going to pin the rest of this down, but I'm also going to pin the tail out of the way as best as I can. And then we're going to get into sewing that seam down. And again, remove pins as needed, because this is a bit of a tight squeeze in between the camera. So let's squish that in there. So I know this is not the easiest to see. So this is my 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to lower the presser foot. Again, as you go through this seam, pins out of the camera's way. Take your time, go slow, especially around those curves. Don't do what I'm doing and record this whole thing while trying to keep everything straight, because it's not going to go very easily, so, you know. And we will top stitch this too. So let me get this done. Where's the ribbon on the inside? Please tell me I didn't sew that by accident. I don't think I did. I don't think I did. I think I'm okay. Pretty sure I'm in the clear. And you'll notice I've got a little bit of an overlap. That's because I think I made a very minor cutting error on the top side. So I'm just adjusting for that cut error. This is where I gotta be careful. Again, go nice and slow. Remove pins as you go. Now I want to sort of show a general pressing guideline. When you're dealing with two pieces of fabric that have to lay flat, you will see this sort of movement where one fabric piece is over scooched in the wrong place. So I'm just going to take this, wet it down a little. What you're going to want to do to make it lie flat is you're going to want to take your fingers and gently roll the top fabric to where the bottom fabric are equidistant. You don't want one peeking out over top of the other. And then we're going to press that down. Now, if you're working with super fuzzy fabrics, what I would suggest is, like, I have this extra cloth here. I've got it underneath all this fabric. You can use a pressing cloth to prevent iron shine. I know that's a little bit difficult when you're trying to do something like this. So if you need to only do around the edge and then take your pressing cloth, put it on top, flatten it, and then iron the whole thing. So this way you minimize flattening the fluff to the point of no return. Now, if you also need to, and this is something that I find sometimes works, like, you know those lint brushes that are usually red that have sort of a texture to it to pick up the lint? You can use those to fluff back up. Anybody who's using faux fur or fun fur for this kind of project, you could probably use something like a cat brush and just kind of gently tease out the fibers so that it doesn't stick into the fabric, so it fluffs it up. And this also goes for anybody, if you have the money to do this, if you are working with something like rabbit fur, because that is a more historically accurate sort of style of hat where people would actually use real fur back in the day before plastics came along to make hats with. Or if they're using something like a really fuzzy wool or something with a lot more texture than flannelette and cotton. So a couple of pro tips that you can use to make your project. Now, I'm not terribly worried about iron shine. It's not going to cause that big of an issue. So as you can see, I'm just flattening this down, but I'm keeping the fuzzy side to the fabric because this type of fabric, the cotton, needs a little bit more heat, I find, especially if it's a little wrinkly. And as you can see, this bit is not quite lying as flat as I'd like it to, so I'm using a lot more water. I'm gonna use a fair bit more steam just to seal that nice and flat. See how much more behaved that's being? It's a good seam. And we're just gonna add a little bit more here. Just gonna flatten that out. And once again, if you find that you are not getting as flat of a surface as you would like, you can take, if you have one, a piece of untreated pine board, heat up your fabric, and then smoosh this down and hold it in place. Because what that does is it removes the heat from the piece, and it also removes a little bit of the moisture so that your seams get really nice, flat, and crisp.
10 seconds later.
And this has been sitting by the window all day, so this is really cold too. See? Now look how nice and flat that is. That's what we want. Yeah, you'll see a little bit of the seams here, but that will eventually fade with time anyways. Now I'm gonna go and do that I'm gonna make another one of these so you have a left and a right ear. I will be back in the next segment once I have that sewn, and I'll show you how we're going to do top stitching. So let's do some top stitching. Much like what we did with the brim, we're going to do the same with the earpieces. And just remember, any of the top stitching that you have at these corners here, that's going to get hidden inside the brim edge, so you can go right up to the edge if you need to and start from there and then go all the way around. And if you really need to, hold your tails out of the way. And just remember, it's okay to go through the layers of the ribbon, just keep the ribbon out of the way. That's one ear down, one to go. Alright, so we have our rim pieces, we have our ear pieces, and we have our lining that we're gonna put in there afterwards. So we have all of our pieces together, now it's time to assemble it. So do you remember those little marks that you made in each of these pieces that I recommended earlier? That is going to be so that it will help with your alignment, because you want a little bit more precision here. So this is important. You can see just from the geometry alone that this is sticking out pretty good, and it's actually starting to look like a hat. In fact, if you really wanted to, if you want to make a baseball cap or a cap with a brim, you could probably use everything that I've taught you today and just extend the brim a little bit out further so that it meets at the sides of the ears so you have more face coverage. But because this is a deerstalker hat, the brim won't be as quite as wide, so this is what we're working with today. So we have our brim, and even just having it pinned, it's popping out. So we know we're on the right track when you have this sort of brim popping action result. How we're going to align this is we're going to take the center markings or cuts that you made. Mine is right here. We're going to align it with the seam for both front and back. So this will be my front piece or the back piece because it'll be mirrored, it'll be identical. And we want to follow this same seam on the inside all the way to the back. So I'm going to pin my brim on the back. It's going to be a little tricky because you're working with a very straight seam and a very curved seam. If you pivot around and pin as you go, it will start taking shape and you'll see how it fits together. It's like a puzzle piece. I am trying to pin this as best as I can while it's still in frame. And you'll see that I'm pivoting it around. And this cut here from the initial brim, because this sticks out a little further, you want to have this edge line up with that cut edge. Not the white part, not the part that's inside out. You want the green. You want to stay on the green. Just like that. Make sure you use as many pins as you feel necessary. Try not to poke yourself like, ow, I just did. Catching yourself on pins is a bit of a hazard, just be careful. If you are using a piece of plastic or Phos-Shape or the 600 weight Phos-Shape or the 400 weight Phos-Shape, if you're using cardboard or whatever it is, the stiffening lining that you have on the inside of your brim, wear safety goggles when sewing this, because if it is really super stiff, you exponentially increase your chance of making the pin break, or hitting a pin, hitting a needle, or having it break on something as you're sewing. So make sure that you wear your eye protection when you go to sew these pieces down especially. It is more important that you stay safe as a person and that your eyeballs stay safe than having something break, hit your eye, and then wind up in the hospital. I can confirm, I have had a few close calls. I've actually had one hit my cheekbone before. Don't ever say that sewing isn't dangerous, because we work with sharp things. Now that I have everything pinned, you'll see it's really starting to look like a deerstalker hat. What we're going to do is we're going to use, remember the knocks that I said to use on the sides in the middle of each of those big pattern pieces for the main crown part? We're going to align the ear flaps to those notches. So for the ear flaps, what I'm going to do, because I have two different types of fabrics, I'm going to want to keep the fuzzy part towards my ears if I ever have to untie the top and put it over top of my ears. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to face the cotton towards the hat and have the fuzzy part exposed. So when I untie them and wear it down, then the roses are exposed, but my ears will stay nice and warm because the fuzzy is closest to the skin. So that is the plan. So I'm going to pin the same way as I did with the brim, match those notches up and pin that down. And then when we sew it all down, this is what it's gonna look like, aside from sticking to the ironing board because it's full of pins. So we're gonna take this over to the machine and we're going to get all of this sewn down. This is the really tricky part where it starts getting difficult to sew, but I believe you can do it. So let's see how much of this I can film for all of you lovely people before I have to stop and try and take the pins out. Oh, it would also help if I grabbed my pin cushion. What I would suggest, because it's one of the easiest places to start, is start on the ear flaps. And be careful that you don't poke your fingers, and you all won't struggle as much as I'm going to struggle because I'm trying to film this at the same time as trying to sew this together, and it's tricky with curved seams. So again, be very precise in your sewing as best as you can, keeping at that 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm starting on one of the ear flaps here, and I'm going to be essentially moving this around as I sew, and I'm going to take out, if you need the pins in there, leave them in until you get right up to the point where you need to take them out, but I'm going to take them out because this is going to annoy the ever-living crap out of me. Now I'm going to be taking my time, and as long as you've cut everything out fairly precisely, it should line up pretty well. Don't mind me, I'm just making an adjustment. For some reason, this machine is a little finicky when starting off, and it doesn't like to start off slow. It either goes or it doesn't. And this is a brand new machine too. I only bought this like maybe 6 months ago. Just go slow, little bits at a time.
.346 minutes later.
So this was not the smoothest execution. Again, struggle bussing with the camera, trying to film it all while trying to not bump it and everything else. So there are some wonky stitches that I made. If I was not filming, it would be a lot smoother. I managed to get it that it's good enough for what I want. Now, what I meant by overstitching is essentially when you sew past the brim pieces and the ear pieces just slightly, essentially giving it a little bit of reinforcement right in here. What that will do is it'll help it prevent from tearing as you wear the hat, because the parts that have the most strain are going to be on these two corners here. So what we need to do next, because we're not quite there yet, we need to take all these edges and fold them in and do some top stitching. We have, again, a flat piece that is meeting a round piece. Now, how we're going to alleviate that is we're actually going to take the curved layer and do little clips all the way along to the seam line, but not over the seam line. You don't want to cut your stitches. You see how this piece is curved and then the other piece is straight. That is because it's like the curved piece on the crown is trying to essentially take on that kind of curved shape, but we don't want it to. Not entirely. So what we're planning on doing is we need to tuck all of this on the inside, and then we're going to top stitch all those brim pieces down, and we're also going to include anything that doesn't have an ear piece. So then that way we can add our lining and scooch it up right to this sewing line on the inside. And I will show you how to do that, but you will have to hand sew that. Yes, there is hand sewing involved in this hat. And I apologize about the shift in lighting. It's partially cloudy, so it's like sun cloud, sun cloud, sun cloud. What you want to do, just to make it a little bit easier, is just clip a little bit. And you can cut the little bit of excess off now. You know, make your little notches. Actually, I'm gonna get my pinking shears to do that for me. So I'm gonna very carefully trim that a little bit. Now, once we get into the top stitching and we fold this all down, you're gonna want to do as small of a top stitch as you possibly can to the initial sewing line. So about 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch. So I'm going to be moving the center of my needle over, and I'm going to use that little window as my guide, because the needle doesn't sit right in that corner. It's like 1/16 of an inch outside of that little very edge of that hole. And this is the seam that I'm talking about going over. So I'm going to try and get very close to that line without going over. For those of you who are new to this project, what I would suggest is don't go in and clip the bulk out of the seam just yet, and use a slightly wider top stitch. So you want to go with 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to go a lot closer than most people would, just because I clipped my seams really far back. Sometimes the process is frustrating. I should know better. Now there's a couple of spots where it might not have sewn down properly, like this bit right here. Or if you have scragglies that are sticking in funny places. Oh, I make mistakes sometimes. For anybody who has a hat that has a blessed seam, you don't want to use a button. You don't have to have a button. I find it helps to hide a little bit of the extra stitching at the top, but again, you don't have to if you don't want to, so long as your seam is really nice and tightly closed and aligned like this. If it is not, and if you would like to hide some of your seams, if it seems to not work out for you as well as you might like, you can use a regular button, or you can use, as I mentioned earlier, a penny. There's a couple of different ways that you can do this. If you really want to, you can use a regular button. Yes, this is made by Mac. It's probably an off-print, an off-cut, or they're just getting rid of inventory for a fashion line that they're not using anymore. Now, if you really want to, you can always flip it over because the backside usually doesn't have any labels. And then you can slap that on top of your hat, stick that on top, stitch it down, and you're good to go. However, if you want something a little bit more couture, a little fancy, what we're gonna do is we're gonna cover our own. And covered buttons is a common occurrence. So essentially what you would do, take your penny, draw a line outside, well, with a lot of seam allowance. So we're talking like 3/4 of an inch if you need to, and cut that out. All right, so we have our penny and we have our spare fabric, and we have a pen to cut it out with. Now, ideally what you want to do is you want to have it set up to cut out for a certain diameter, so you have tails at the end of your fabric when you cut it out to sew the button down onto your hat. So what we need to do is place our penny, and we're going to trace a circle with our penny. You can do this with a button too, or anything that is flat and round like a penny. You could do this with a button, you could do this with a dime or a quarter, or however big you want the button on the top of your hat to be. And we're going to give ourselves a really generous amount, like, here, let's see how much space we have here. 1.5-ish. Doesn't have to be perfect because eventually it'll work itself out. So we're going to give ourselves a couple of dots just to kind of give ourselves that cutting space. Doesn't quite have to be this big. You'll have probably extra tails at the end that you can trim off after you're done. It doesn't have to be perfect as long as it's got space. Then we're gonna cut that out. All right, so we have our circle. Take a look and get a measurement roughly about how much the diameter of your penny is, or not the diameter, your radius. So the radius is about 3/4 of an inch. The center is, we're talking about 3/8-ish. So we're going to mark a 3/8 inch line all the way around the trace of the penny. And if you really need to, you can probably go half, but for a tighter fit, you probably want to go with the 3/8. And you don't have to worry because this won't be seen on the outside. This is all on the inside of the hat. If you really want to erase it, you could probably hit it with some steam. We're going to trace around where those dots are. So we have our stitch line, and you will want color matching thread. And you'll also want a hand stitching needle that matches the fiber type that you're working with. Now, I'm working strictly with woven material, so I am going to use a Sharps needle. If you have a thimble, now would be a good time to grab it, because while you're sewing, you don't want to hurt your fingies. It takes practice getting used to sewing with a thimble, but eventually you can get used to doing it. If you are a nail person who likes to use a lot of nail oil, now is not the time to apply said nail oil, because you do not want to have your fingers slipping around or getting oil stains on any of your fabric. You can double up your thread, and for anybody who's wondering, this is a basic Gutermann 500 yards polyester. Yes, I work with polyester thread, don't at me. Can work with cotton if you want to. Use what you have available. I'm not going to begrudge anybody for using polyester thread. Now what you're going to do is you're going to do what's called a running stitch all the way around on your stitching line. You don't have to have your penny in the place in the moment. In and out and in and out. And this is where most sewists will have some music on in the background, or watching your favorite show, or making sure that you have some tea. This is pumpkin chai. And I don't care, it's February. I'm gonna have my pumpkin chai until it runs out. So now that we have all of our running stitches made, start with the threads on the outside of the fabric, and we're going to pull so that it makes a little bowl. And before you pull it super tight, put your penny back in and close that up. So it looks like this. What I would suggest is make a knot so that that doesn't come unraveled, and then do a couple of wraps with your thread. That will keep it really super tight and secure. If you need to, you can take a couple of extra stitches and pull more of the bulk in towards the center of this backing here, because this is going to be your button and it's going to sit like this on top of the hat. This feels a little loose. I could have probably gone a little closer than a 3/8 of an inch. I'm not sure how well you can see this. This is my stitch line. I'm going to move my needle a little bit lower, stab it, and I'm going to repeat this, do sort of a secondary running stitch just to pull that in a little tighter. And it's below the initial stitch that I made to start eking it in so that this top piece is really nice and tight. See, we're getting nice and tight, and that's good. You want a really tight base. Like if you get bumpies like what I'm seeing over here, you can go back and sort of pull the catch the fabric further up, like about halfway, and then stitch it downwards towards the running stitch that you made initially. Seeing that kind of evened itself out. You can do this as much as you feel the need to. What we're going to do once we're done tightening, we're going to wrap it a couple times, sew a stay stitch so that that raveling doesn't come unraveled. See, there we go. We have our button. It's nice and taut. It has its nice lovely shank. The thread can also serve as an anchor point for when you go to sew it onto the hat so that it doesn't go anywhere. Now what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to trim this off about there. That's about, I don't know, 1/2 inch-ish. I would recommend, if you have it, you can use some fray check. I have a bottle here that I haven't even opened yet, so I'm gonna keep that handy. I'm gonna trim this down as much as I think I can get away with. You don't want too long of a shank. Much like sewing, trim slow and try not to trim too much. See, I still have a nice little support butt there. Hopefully that won't stick out. It shouldn't. And again, if you don't want to do this method, you don't have to. You can just go and get like a 4-hole or a 2-hole or even a shanked button, sew it onto the top of your hat and call it done. I'm going fancy and showing what you can use at home if you don't have buttons. All right, now that I have the fray stop glued, it's nice and sealed, we're going to put this on the top. This may be a little bit tricky because of the fray stop and the bulk and everything else. If you can, trim it down as far as you humanly possibly can. And we're going to primarily try to sew close to the stitching and even like try and pull the fabric from the top of the button to close as close to the actual top of the fabric of the hat as possible. So that way it will sit flush like that, but it'll kind of hide some of the scraggly bits of the fabric. If you really need to though, you can trim it a little further down. I might actually just do that just so there's not quite so much height. And we'll get started sewing this down onto the hat. I also have to see how far down the fray stop goes just to make sure that it's not going to fray again. If it does, we'll get it out, do another pass, and we'll get started. Whatever you do, do not cut the thread on your wrapping, and don't cut your initial threads that you made to cinch the fabric in, because otherwise you'll have to find another piece and start again. Now that I have the shorter button, this is probably about as short as you want to go. We're gonna sew that on. So starting from the inside of the hat, we're going to double up our thread, make sure we have a knot, make sure you have your thimble on, and we'll get sewing. Ooh, I have some chalk dust on my hat. There we go. All right, so we're gonna sew. I don't know how well you can see this. I know the lighting is not the best.
12 seconds later.
There, now we have light. Okay, So, starting from the inside of the hat, you want to try and get it as dead center as you can. And we're gonna use the center point here on the hat best as you can. Come up. And just like a shanked button, because that is what this kind of is now, we're going to put the needle through the button above that wrap point, or in the middle of that wrap point. Take your time, push your needle through, try not to stab yourself. I find when I'm sewing, I tend to stab myself on pins more than I do with the needle itself. But sometimes it happens. If it gets stuck like this, you can use pliers to pull it out. Sometimes I find with really tricky spots, you sort of need pliers to pull it. Ah, I do. I always keep a pair of pliers handy by my desk for such an occasion. I especially need them half the time when I'm sewing leather, because it gets really stiff. So you have your button sewn through, place it as dead center and hold it as dead center as you can, sew it back through, and essentially you're just gonna go in and out and in and out and in and out multiple times till this gets as flush with this surface as it can on the bottom as you can. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be good enough to hide any white spots of the tails from the shank of the buttons. So this will take a little bit for me to sew through. And if you need to, you could probably even whip stitch it in place around the shank. And once it's done, just clip that off. And that looks pretty good to me. I don't know about you. What do you think? And now you know how to make a button out of pennies. We need to tackle the lining. Let me get that, and I will show you how to go about setting the lining in. We're getting close to the home stretch, folks. One of the things that you can do, this is totally optional, you can use Petersham grosgrain ribbon. This is specifically a ribbon that is intended to stretch ever very slightly, but this ribbon also can make a curve. You can identify Petersham grosgrain ribbon by these little bumps across the top of the ribbon here. I will post a picture of a type of grosgrain ribbon that is not going to curve for you. You want the curvy type. You can usually get this at various craft stores or sewing supply stores, things like that. And you don't want to, for the sweatband, use anything like ribbon. This is just a decorative satin or sort of like a matte. It's a little shiny, semi-glossy ribbon. You don't want to use this because it will not curve and it does not stretch. Ideally, you want something that will curve and conform to your head. Additionally, one of the types of sweatbands that you want to try and avoid is twill tape. This is twill tape. Again, it doesn't really stretch. It is cotton, but it doesn't really stretch. It's intended for strength more so than conforming around a thing to conform to your body. Alternatively, if you can't get this type of grosgrain, one of the things that I have been contemplating on experimenting with that you might be able to use is something like bias cut fabric. This is bias tape. It is mass manufactured. This one is probably a cotton polyester blend, and this does stretch a little bit. It may not necessarily take a curve when you iron it. However, it may work as a substitute for, because it is a little bit stretchy and because it stretches on the bias, to curve around your head and using it as a substitute. But most bias tape is not finished, so you may need to finish the top edge before you install it into your hat. So we need to measure out, okay, so I said my head size was 23. We need to make it at least 24 and a little bit, because you want to allow for the seam allowance and overlap of your grosgrain ribbon. This is not an exact measurement, but this is going to be close enough. All right, so if you want to, what you can do is you can pin this to your ironing board. Ideally, you want to have the curve going all sort of in one direction on one side. You don't want to have it going wibbly wibbly. Now wibbly wibbly is a technical term. You want to curve it as you iron So it starts creating, see how it has that gentle curve? That's kind of what you want. Go slow, take your time. I'm using my iron on the maximum heat here. You don't have to spend a lot of time doing it, but you want a nice gentle curve. Essentially, the wider spot is going to go towards the top of the head because that will eventually morph and weld into your head size. And then this is going to be the bottom portion where you sew it, and we're going to use a felling stitch to sew this down. Again, you can skip this step if you want to, but it will also hide a lot of interior mistakes before you put the lining in. So it's entirely up to you if you want to install a sweatband. I will do that as the last part, but for now, let's get started in on how to install the lining first. So we have our lining and it's going to slide into the hat. What we need is we need a surface to sew with because we are going to be hand sewing the lining in. It is not necessarily the easiest technique, but it is a lot cleaner and nicer than doing it by machine. We have 1/2 inch seam allowance on this. You can fudge with the seam allowance slightly because this is going to be inside the hat. It's not going to be seen as easily. It will sort of conform and curve and bunch up on the inside of the hat to conform essentially to your head and the shape of the hat itself. If you want to, you can take a ruler and then figure out what your 1/2 inch allowance is. What you want to do is you want to have the seamed side towards the inside of the hat, and you want the non-sticky outy seam side facing towards your head. So you have to essentially use a tailor's ham or use your balled up towel. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to fold the raw edge up and into the hat by your 1/2 inch towards the raw edge seams that you made earlier, and then give it a light pressing. The reason for this is because this will give you a surface edge to work with. So when you're sewing it, you'll be able to use this to hide your stitches a little bit, and we're going to be felling that into place as well. All right, so what you want to ideally do, if you can't, it's understandable, but you want to have your seam of your lining match up with the seam of the outer shell, and you want to place your edge in a way that you can hide all of the stitching with the seam allowance. I realize I cut this a little shorter than I should have, but that's okay. We'll manage. If we need to, that's now the back of the hat. And if you need to, use a lot of pins. I'm probably going to be sewing this almost directly on this previous stitch line. And if you need to, use a lot of pins and tack the seams of the lining down to where the seam on the hat is, and do that for all points first, so that way you have your placement, because it will look nicer that way. And we're going to go all the way around. Now, because this is your first hat, it doesn't have to be exact, and if you wind up with a little bit of gaping, don't worry, it should fit if your sewing was precise. And if you need to, you can just sort of eke it along, sitting in there nicely. So we're going to grab our green thread and we're going to start sewing all this around. And when you're sewing, you don't want to go all the way through the hat. You want to try and catch it on the layers that are closest to you on the fabric. And you want to try and not go over the outer seam lines if you can. You can place it on the seam, you can stitch on the seam, you can do what's called stitching in the ditch, but try your best. What I'm going to demonstrate for you, I'm just going to use up the tails because this is just a sample piece, but I'm going to show you a couple of different stitches that you can use to insert your lining and put it onto your hat. So this piece is the lining. Actually, let me mark that for sure so that you know what it is. So let me just, so you have your lining and your knot lining. Now you can do a couple of different stitches. For what I've used in school and for what I've used in millinery class is the felling stitch. So we're going to start off with that. You can hide your knot inside the layers of this fold. So the knot is in between the two layers. So we have our lining and our not lining. And this fold is going to be the seam that we're going to go with. So essentially you pick up 1 or 2 little threads, come over here, and you're going to go from top to bottom, so essentially kind of trapping both layers and picking up a couple more stitches. I don't know how well you can see this on camera, but I'm trying to show you as best I can. And you can make them shorter or wider. When you're working with a lining, you can go a little wider because it doesn't have to be held in super secure. I mean, it's got to be secure enough so that it's not going to fall out. So that's one of the stitches that you can use. It's almost like a whip stitch, but it's not quite a whip stitch. Or you can use a cross stitch. So you want to go kind of backwards to the direction you're moving in. So instead of going this way, you're going this way. So you bring your needle up, you make a small stitch going in this direction, like so, and you see how the threads cross over? Then you come back a little ahead here, pick up a couple stitches, and that makes a little bit of an X there. And you can do that all the way down for your lining as well. And if you need this stitch demonstrated again, it's also a hemming stitch, and I made a short on it earlier. Feel free to go check that out if you need it. So now that I've got everything sewn down, tied up, we still have a little bit of this green here. Now, one of the things that you can do, and this is not necessarily always going to be advised, if you clip it a little short and you have some white stuff showing through, get a fabric marker. Make sure it's a fabric marker, not a Sharpie. And then you can go in and cover over all of that, let it dry, and you should be fine. It won't be that noticeable. One of the other things that we're going to do is we're going to add the sweatband. So remember, the inside curve is going to fit along the edge, and we're gonna butt this grosgrain almost right at the sewing line, like just like a 1/16 of an inch below it. And we're gonna do that all the way around to hide this seam. And we're gonna use a felling stitch, as I showed earlier how to do that. Just leave yourself a little bit of a tail for the overlap for your ribbon on the inside. So if you need to, fold it just a scotch. It will usually keep a crease. Tack that down, pin it if you need to, and sew along here. And when you're sewing the grosgrain down, you can use the lines and little bumps as a guide. And generally speaking, you want to do every 2 to 3 bumps is where you're going to place your stitch. So we're getting close to the last stretch before we need to sew up this center back seam. I realize this is not directly on the center back. Again, this is just for me and for showcasing this. If you were making one for somebody else, I suggest scooching that over a little bit. I suppose I could. Here, let me just... because ideally you want all your seams to match, right? And we'll be sewing that up together. So I'm going to finish this last inch, and then we'll get into sewing the two pieces together. Again, you can hide your needle and your ends of the thread inside the fold you want to have a little bit of wiggle room. So you don't want to have the angle of the seam tucked in. You want it to sit as parallel as possibly can. This is not going to be a perfect stitch, but I'm going to do this up with just a little bit of a ladder stitch. There we go. And to finish it off, open up the seam a little bit, tuck your needle through, and tack it down on this side of the grosgrain, just on the inside. It doesn't have to be fancy, or you can pick up the stitches that you previously made and just secure it that way too. And with that, your hat is done. So last thing I wanted to mention is if this does not sit flat, just so that it can until it's seasoned, conditioned, molded to your head, because the steam and the oils and everything from your own head will eventually make this sit a lot more flat, because it's meant to curve, so it will mold to the shape of your head. If you really want to, and this is something that they didn't go over in the class, but it's something that I have seen done on other garments, is that you can take a couple of tack points and sew it down to the lining itself, so that way it won't flip out and flop out on you. You probably want to do that in like 1/8 or 1/16 of a section on each seam, so then that way it's nice and secure all the way around. It gives it a nicer finished look too. And if you really need to, you can go in with an iron to flatten all that down. Just make sure that you use a tailor's ham or something to support it. Thank you once again for joining us on this DIY adventure with some hat making and millinery techniques. In the meantime, if you happen to like what you see, if my videos help you, please like, subscribe, and comment, because that will help the channel overall. If you would like to help monetarily, I do happen to have a Ko-Fi, and I will put the QR code somewhere up here. I will also have all of my socials listed at the end of this video. So in the meantime, I hope you all have fun. To the Holo Del Taco detectives, keep up the good work, and I will see you all next time. Bye!